Hi everyone and welcome back to the Data Football Club. One league, 36 teams, 8 games to qualify to the round of 16. This is the new format of the Champions League. If you cannot make complete sense of this new format, or if you'd like to better understand why this new format was created or the pros and cons associated with it, you're in the right place. So with no further ado, let's get the ball rolling. The format of the Champions League that we know today is radically different to what it was during its early days. To better understand how it evolved through time, I have split the history of the Champions League into 3 different eras which correspond to 3 significantly different formats, with the third format being the one introduced in 2024. Looking only at the main tournament, so after qualifying rounds, from 1955 to 1991, it was a single knockout format. It started from round of 16 up until season 66-67 and round of 32 afterwards. From 1991, the main tournament was still made up of 32 teams, with 2 initial knockout rounds organized before a group stage followed by a final knockout round. This quickly changed to become just group stages and a final knockout round in 97-98 as we know it today. And finally, we'll now be watching the new Champions League with 36 teams in a single league followed by a knockout round, also starting at the round of 16 with additional playoffs between the league phase and the knockout rounds. So that's it for a very quick overview of the 3 eras of the Champions League, as I like to call them. And now, let's start at the beginning, shall we? Who organizes the Champions League? Well, that will be UEFA. UEFA, or Union of European Football Associations, was created in 1954 after discussions initiated by the French, Belgian and Italian football associations, with a total of 31 founding member associations. The 31 associations became more than 50 in total in the 90s because of the fragmentation of various European countries, such as the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, that therefore created new football associations in the newly created countries. The total number of football associations affiliated to the UEFA today are now 55. I am telling all this only to insist on the fact that the Champions League was not supposed to be a tournament where the final is always between Spanish and English teams, with sometimes a German or Italian team joining the party. Actually, very far from that. With the UEFA creation in 1954 came the first ever Coupe des Clubs Champions Européens, or European Cup in English, that was organized during season 55-56. It will gain the name Champions League only in season 92-93, but we'll come back to that. Some of you maybe have noticed that this very long French title for the European Cup, Coupe des Clubs Champions Européens, is still the one engraved on the trophy today. Vive la France! The first year, 16 associations were invited to send a team to take part in the first ever European Cup. As I've said in a previous video about Hibernian FC, the goal was obviously to have the best teams in Europe, so obviously the champions of each association. However, some champions declined, but the first edition of the tournament still had a lot of the best teams at the time taking part, such as Hibernian FC, Real Madrid, or even Reims in France. By the way, a big shout out to all the Hibs fans and interested viewers that watched the video on Hibs. It is by far the most viewed on the channel so far, so thank you for that. And the next club I'll cover will hopefully be coming by the end of the year, so stay tuned. You can try and guess in the comments what team it could be, but I'm pretty sure no one will get it. The format of the first European Cup was really simple, as it was just a knockout starting from the round of 16. The tournament was a great success, with Real Madrid, who else, lifting the trophy first, as they did the following years as well. The 2-leg matches that we are very familiar with today was already a standard back then, which means that the whole tournament had a total of 31 games. The following years, a single preliminary or qualifying round that consisted in a 2-leg match was organized to let other associations join. Out of the 21 teams that aimed to take the trophy of Real Madrid, 9 teams got a direct entry to the main tournament, and the remaining 12 had to play a preliminary 2-legged match to qualify. The draw was made by geographical location, and it was random whether you got a direct entry or if you had to play in the qualifying matches. In the end, there were still 16 teams in the main tournament table. It's only in season 66-67 that the Cup included 32 teams in the main tournament, which meant that it started now from round of 32 instead of round of 16. So that was a total of 63 games instead of the previous 31. Keep that in mind when we talk about the number of games of the new format of the Champions League. Back then, 33 associations were participating in the Cup, meaning that 29 were directly qualified and only 4 had to play a qualifying round. From what I gather, it is not clear whether the teams playing the qualifying round were still sampled at random, but it is likely that it was not random anymore, as UEFA were starting to work on a method of ranking the associations and awarding the clubs belonging to top-ranked associations buys to the main tournament, while clubs from lower-ranked associations gained access through the qualifying round. This ranking was first released in 1979 and was based on the infamous UEFA coefficient, but we'll come back to that in the next section of the video. During season 91-92, the European Cup entered a second era with the introduction of group stages in the main tournament. The first version of the format that we have been watching for the last 3 decades was somewhat peculiar and changed often during the 90s. 32 teams were present in the main tournament, so that bit didn't change, and the tournament started off with 2 knockout rounds between all qualified teams. So 24 teams were actually out before even entering the group stages. Then, the remaining 8 teams were separated into 2 groups, and each team played all the other teams in the same way it was done until last year. However, after all matches were played within the group, the first team of each group were the only teams qualified to play the final knockout, which only consisted of 1 match, the final of the tournament. During season 92-93, the European Cup changed its name for the Champions League, a name more consistent with the addition of the group stage. A preliminary qualifying round between associations that newly joined UEFA before the 2 knockout rounds of the main tournament preceding the group stages was also added. That year, Olympique de Marseille won the tournament, the only French team to ever do so far, and so the first team to ever win the Champions League. Marseille fans really like to brag about that, and it's good for them, although they also are the only team ever to have been prevented from entering the competition the next year, despite holding the title, because they were accused of fixing a match in Ligue 1 in the previous year. Anyway, UEFA must have thought that having just 1 final after the group stage wasn't really enough, so in 93-94 we had the 2 first teams of the 2 groups qualify for a semi-final instead of just 1 final. Then, season 94-95 became a crucial year in the history of the Champions League, as it was the first time that champions from top-ranked associations received buys to the main tournament, starting in the group stage, and no longer with the 2 first knockout rounds that were completely replaced with a single qualifying round. More specifically, the 7 best associations, as well as the title holder, were directly placed in the final tournament table, with 4 groups that were made instead of the previous 2, and the final knockout phase starting in the quarterfinals this time, with still the 2 best teams in the 4 groups qualifying for that knockout. The 2 following seasons had the similar format, and it's only in season 97-98, what a beautiful year, that we introduced 2 qualifying rounds with the lower ranked teams entering the first qualifying round and the middle ranked teams entering directly the second round of qualifications. Still 8 teams received buys to the group stages, but the other major change that year was that not just champions were allowed to join, but depending on your association ranking, runners-up were also allowed to join the qualifying round. And that's the year when the Champions League should have again changed its name, because not only champions were now invited to the Champions League. But who cares? Season 98-99 had 6 groups instead of the previous 4, with 8 teams directly qualified to the group stage. The top-ranked teams of the 6 groups, as well as the 2 best second teams, qualified for quarterfinals. And at last, season 99-2000 finally gave us the current format, or rather the format of the last 2 decades, in terms of the main tournament, with 8 groups in total, and the top 2 teams of each group qualifying for the round of 16. This format has not changed drastically since then, at least for the main tournament. Only qualification rules were modified throughout the years, but we'll come back to that in the next chapter of the video. Now, about the new format. According to UEFA, 36 teams will be placed in a single league with 8 games to play. As usual, a victory awards 3 points and a draw 1 point. After all teams have played their 8 games, we get a final ranking of the 36 teams. The 8 top teams are directly qualified for the round of 16, and teams ranked 9 to 24 will have to play a 2-leg playoff to qualify to the round of 16. The remaining teams will be eliminated, and there will be no more spots for the Europa League. So that's it for the evolution of the format of the Champions League in terms of the main tournament, but there are a lot of questions still pending. Why 8 games and not more or less? Which teams will your favorite Champions League team be paired with to play these 8 games? We'll answer them and more in the next sections of the video, but I guess we'll start with the most pressing question. How does a European club from one of the 55 associations qualify to the new Champions League? Let's start with a bit of history to understand how the current system works. Up until season 97-98, only champions and the runners-up of the previous title holder were allowed to join the European Cup. So only one spot was available per association, except for the association that won the previous cup. Originally, every team qualified directly to the main tournament, but because the number of associations was greater than the number of spots available in the main tournament, UEFA quickly introduced a preliminary qualifying round to have only 16 and then 32 teams in the main tournament. This preliminary qualifying round was originally played by teams sampled at random, but UEFA quickly realized that if strong teams are eliminated too early, it might hinder the interest around the competition. So they started to reflect on a possible ranking of associations that would determine whether a team belonging to a certain association would receive a bye to the main tournament or would have to play a qualifying round. That is the greatly infamous and often misunderstood UEFA coefficient, firstly published in 1979. Technically, there are two coefficients that serve different purposes, the association coefficient and the club coefficient. Essentially, the association coefficient decides which teams receive byes to the main tournament and which teams have to enter a qualifying round. The club coefficient influences the seeding system that determines which teams play each other at a certain stage of the competition. From that, it is quite clear that it is in your own interest to support the teams from your association in European Cups, as they greatly impact the ability of your league to have more spots available for the next edition of the tournament. Picture for a minute a world where hardcore Everton fans went to support Liverpool in the Champions League or Marseille fans for Paris. What a nice idea! That is never going to happen though. The ranking coefficient introduced in 1979 was an association coefficient and has not radically evolved up until the one we know today. To calculate the UEFA association coefficient, you essentially sum all the points won by teams belonging to that association in European competitions, that also includes other tournaments organized by UEFA such as the Europa League or the Conference League, and you divide this number of points by the number of teams of your association involved in European competitions that season. You also get bonus points for reaching different stages of the competition. The number of bonus points awarded has changed over the years, but what matters most is that the UEFA coefficient is not reset completely every season. Instead, it is an average of the association coefficient calculated over the last 5 years, so as long as your association's team perform well over 3 or 4 of the last 5 years, you'll still have a pretty decent UEFA association coefficient and still be able to qualify a significant number of teams, because we'll see that it is a major advantage to be a top-ranked association, especially today. Conversely, if your teams perform amazingly well during a single year, if they do not repeat the same amazing performance the following years, it will not be enough to radically move up in the ranking. Moving averages will always smooth out the ranking and hinder sudden changes. And don't just take my word for it. Throughout history, only 4 out of the 55 associations made it to the top of the UEFA coefficient ranking: Spain, England, Germany, or rather West Germany, and Italy. I wonder whether this illustrates the argument made that the UEFA coefficient benefits only a minority of clubs and associations, but I'll leave that for you to decide. Now that you hopefully better understand how the UEFA association coefficient is calculated, let's explain what it really means for qualifying to the European Cup. As we said earlier, up until season 97-98, only the champions or the runner-up of the previous Champions League winner were allowed to join the European Cup. Today we know that some leagues can provide as much as 4 and sometimes even 5 representatives in the European Cup. How is that decided? Well, this all comes down to a magical thing called the access list. The access list is a table that gives the number of teams able to join the Champions League from each association and at which stage of the competition, namely the qualifying rounds or the main tournament. It is published by UEFA on a yearly basis or when a major change is implemented. More specifically, this access list is agnostic of the associations, but rather gives a spot to the association ranked at a certain position based on the association coefficient. Let's have a look at some example access lists in the 3 different eras. During season 80-81 of the European Cup, it was very simple. If you're a champion of an association affiliated to UEFA, you would get a spot and enter a random draw, deciding whether you would be part of the 2 teams playing the 2-leg qualifying round. The runner-up of the previous title holder would also join that draw, and that's it. Moving to the second era, if we look at the access list of season 2002-2003, things are getting more complex. Only the champions of the 9 top-ranked associations got a direct ticket to the main tournament of the Champions League. So about 40 champions had to go through at least 1 qualifying round to qualify. Not only that, but the 6 runners-up of the top 6 associations also got a direct ticket. So not only the lower-ranked associations got less spots, but they also had to go through a series of knockout qualification rounds. Actually, the champions of 22 associations had to go through not 1, not 2, but 3 qualifying rounds. That's 6 games you have to play in the summer when other players are either on holiday or preparing their season nicely with their club. Clearly, this is usually the most crucial part of a season to get players ready to play in intense games every 3 to 4 days. More recently, during the years 2021 to 2024, the title holder of the Champions League but also the winner of the Europa League were given direct access to the group stage, as well as 10 champions of the 10 top associations. The top 4 associations also had the 3 following teams in their national league directly qualified to the Champions League. That inevitably resulted in lower ranked associations having even fewer spots and more qualifying rounds to enter. From Association 16 in the ranking, you only have 1 spot granted to the champion of your league with 4 or 5 rounds to qualify. A preliminary round, 3 qualifying rounds, and a playoff. That's 10 potential games to play over the summer when you are supposed to get ready for your season. Needless to say that I don't recall any team achieving that impossible mission. If you know one, please let me know in the comment section below. I'd like to see PSG or Real Madrid play 10 games over the summer to try and qualify for the Champions League. So how about the access list of the new format? Well, I was quite surprised when I discovered that there seems to be some effort made to make it fairer. Let's not get too excited though, as it's not such a great revolution for equal opportunity, but it still is worth mentioning. With 36 teams in the main tournament now, there are 4 additional spots up for grabs. The teams that directly qualify for the league phase are the champions of associations ranked 1 to 10, the runners-up of associations 1 to 6, the 3rd place team from association 1 to 5, and the 4th place team from associations 1 to 4. So that is a total of 25 teams directly qualifying to the league phase, only coming from 10 associations out of 55. The rest of the teams will enter the qualifying rounds at a certain stage as shown here. However, there are 4 more direct slots awarded to teams to allow them to directly join the league phase, and this is where 2 very nice ideas were put in place in my opinion. 2 of these 4 additional spots will be given to the 2 associations with the highest coefficients of the previous year. Just the previous year. So it is still big associations that get more direct qualifying spots this time, but this will be a good opportunity for associations with 1 or a few clubs that perform very well in the European competitions during a specific year to get more spots the following year. It kinda counterbalances the 5-year moving average that is still highly in favor of very well-established associations. Even better, the remaining 2 additional spots directly qualifying for the league phase will be given directly to 2 clubs with the highest coefficients that were supposed to join the qualifying rounds according to the access list. In the qualifying rounds, there are 2 tracks: the Champions track with all associations champions who join the qualifying round, and the league track with all the remaining teams that access the qualifying rounds by placing high enough in their national league. So out of the clubs in the qualifying champions track, the one with the highest coefficient goes directly into the league phase without playing the qualifying matches they were meant to play. And the same thing goes for the qualifying league track clubs. And what's really cool is that this is regardless of the stage where you were meant to enter the qualifying rounds or playoffs. So this is a great shortcut for clubs that are not part of the high-performing associations, but have performed very well themselves over the past few years in European competitions. This year, the 2 spots will be given to Shakhtar Donetsk for the Champions track and Benfica Lisbon for the League track. Now that we know how the Champions League evolved through time in terms of format and how to qualify, let's have a look at the pairing system. By pairing system, I mean which team is drawn against which other team. We're mainly going to focus on the main tournament, as the qualifying rounds have all been mostly random, with part of the draw made up in the access list, with teams joining at a certain stage of the qualifying rounds. In first era, the draw was purely random at first, and then evolved to a semi-random draw, where teams were put in pots for qualifying rounds, not based on their rankings, but based on geographical location. This was preventing too much travel for teams at a time where flights were not so cheap for clubs. In the second era, the draw with pots of varying levels was the standard, with ultimately 4 pots from season 99-2000. The 8 groups were made by picking 1 team in every pot. Also, 2 teams from the same association were not allowed to be drawn in the same group. But it essentially works similarly to the association coefficient, except that it is based solely on the results of the club in European competitions. However, if the club has no record in competition in the last 5 years, the association coefficient, or a percentage of that coefficient, is used instead for that club. Anyway, each team is placed in one of the 4 pots and gets 8 opponents, 2 from each pot, drawn against them. That is really interesting, and it's a big change as it means that there won't be two legs played against the same team as was the standard for decades. That can be quite disturbing and at first could seem unfair. However, there are very good reasons behind it. In fact, there is another sport that is using this exact system in a majority of their tournaments. That sport is chess. Yes, chess is a sport as recognized by the International Olympic Committee. Whether you disagree or not, take your complaints to them, I am merely the messenger. So when you think about it for a minute, chess has a lot in common with football when thinking about how to set up a tournament. You can either win, lose or draw, and you have either home advantage playing with white, or you play away playing with black. With sometimes more than 100 players joining a tournament, it is simply unrealistic to make everyone play against each other with both colors. So they came up with the current standard in chess for open tournaments, which is the Swiss system. That is a tournament where you play usually no more than 10 games, you never play another player twice, and you alternate, most often, the color of your pieces every game. At the very least, you should have the same amount of games played with white and the same amount of games played with black. Every player plays the same number of games, and at the end, the one with the most points wins. Coming back to football, for most of the first and second era of the European Cup, all possible matches were played in groups with one game at home and one away apart from the final. If we were to do that in the new format with a league of 36 teams, we'd be looking at 70 games per team, which is already much more than the number of weeks in a year. So how do we narrow this number of games down while still having a good approximation of what the ranking table would have looked like if we had played all the games? Well, we use the Swiss system. Like in chess, not every team will be playing each other, however we will get a pretty good approximation of the final ranking, as if that is what had been done. But what is the ideal number of games to play for a certain number of participants? Well, obviously the more games you play, the better the approximation of the final ranking you'll get. Yet, a very simple observation would be to note that the minimal existing pairing system we already know is the knockout format. With 32 teams, the knockout format has 5 rounds, with half the teams being eliminated every round. But what if these teams were not eliminated? What if we allowed these teams to also play 5 games? What would change? The best team by definition should be able to defeat all the other opponents and would still be at the top of the ranking, right? How many times do we hear in knockout formats that a certain team had an easy or hard draw? Well, with a system where every team plays the same number of games with opponents of similar levels, this effect can be mitigated. So if we formalize mathematically what we've just said, the idea of a knockout format is simple. Split the table in half and keep only one half, then repeat the process until you get only one team. So it is essentially dividing the table by 2 a certain number of times, and that number of times will be the number of matches you'll have to play to get the minimal idea of a winner. So if we can write the number of participants x as 2 to the power y, we need the minimum of y games. In maths, we write y as the base 2 logarithm of x. With 36 teams in the new format, we just need to calculate the base 2 logarithm of 36 to get our answer with the minimum number of matches to be played. That is roughly equal to 5.17 matches. Rounding this number up gives us a minimum of 6 matches to be played. I'm not so sure why UEFA chose to have 8 games instead of the minimum of 6 we've just calculated, but that's probably to account for the 4 pots they are used to. One limitation of this approximation is obviously the element of time that we discarded here, as it is not the same team you play in September than in January, with injuries, evolution of tactics, but also squad with the winter transfer window. But it still should be a fair approximation. Before wrapping up this section, I just wanted to tell you one last thing about the draw of the Champions League taking place on the 29th of August. Interestingly, and for the first time in the history of UEFA, the draw will be hybrid, so half led by humans, as we're used to, and half led by a computer. The reason behind that choice is that UEFA calculated that to hold the ceremony in a traditional fashion, it would require more than 3 hours, which is not really feasible. This comes from the countless possibilities of matching every single team to 7 others amongst 35. Overall, I am quite excited for this new format of the Champions League, and I made a little list of pros and cons to wrap up this video, starting with the pros. First of all, and from a fan's perspective, we'll get more matches to watch, so that's already nice, especially for teams of lower-ranked associations, with a guarantee of watching at least 8 games of your favorite team in the Champions League, so also more revenues for those clubs. One argument that UEFA is also quite proud about is the fact that there will be more excitement and drama until the 8th match, as your team's final ranking will depend on all the other teams, so you'll not be looking exclusively at your team's group, so 3 other teams, but at the whole table. Furthermore, every team will be playing the same number of teams from every pot, meaning that it may be fairer than before, as before, a team from the 4th pot would play only teams from pots of higher levels in theory. And if it's not significantly fairer, at least it gives more balanced level games to watch all throughout the league phase. Also, there will be more incentive to finish at the top of the league in the new format than finishing at the top of the group in the previous format. That's because you are more likely to play a weaker team than before in the round of 16 by placing first. Teams ranked first of their group could only be drawn against a team that finished second before, but teams that finished second in a certain group could have been easily first in another one, while in the new format, we'll get a holistic view of the relative levels of all participating teams. In addition, none of the lower ranked teams in the league will get a free entry to the Europa League, which I believe was really ruining the balance and independence of each European competition. As for the cons, obviously having more matches might have a bad outcome on the quality of the matches with a heavy calendar. Just to give you an idea, the first era had 63 matches in the main tournament from the end of the 60s, the second era had 125 matches, so already quite a lot, but now we are talking about a total of 189 matches, which is getting a bit mad, to be honest. Also, something that could be easily missed is that it actually is definitely harder to qualify to the round of 16 now in this format. With only 8 direct spots, it's as if in the previous era, all the teams that finished second and all the teams that finished third of their group had to play a playoff instead of the seconds directly qualifying to the round of 16. So another match to play to decide who will go through, and you could get kicked out before the round of 16 despite placing 9th in the league. With that being said, I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please hit that like button and share it with your teammates. Also, let me know in the comment section below which team you'll be supporting in the next season of the Champions League. And if you want to join the Data Football Club, please subscribe and don't forget to click on the bell icon. See you soon for another video where football's the game and data's the goal. Bye bye!